Okay. Let's get started. Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Truong, and I am a PhD candidate of geology here at Oregon State University.
My name is Jennifer Wong-Ala, and I am a PhD student in Ocean, Earth, and Atmospheric Science. We are organizers of the Unpacking Diversity professional learning community.
We would like to start this event with some acknowledgements. This event is being broadcasted from Oregon State University in Corvallis, Oregon. Corvallis sits on the traditional homelands of the Marys River or Ampinafu Band of Kalapuya, who were forcibly removed to reservations in Western Oregon in 1855. Oregon State University prides itself on being a land, sea, space, and sun grant institution. It is one of the only US institutions to have all four designations. What does it mean to be a land grant institution? For OSU, it means the endowment that created the university included the income derived from over 90,000 acres of dispossessed native land. I also want to note that since 2009, American Indian and Alaskan Native student enrollment has declined by nearly 50%, now representing less than 0.5% of enrolled students. Let's continue to think about what it means to live uninvited on someone else's land. We, the organizers, extend our solidarity with the struggle of Indigenous peoples worldwide. For those of you who are new to us, Unpacking Diversity is a graduate student-led initiative working at the intersection of social justice and the earth sciences. Our story begins in 2017, when 3 graduate students met for the first time at a social justice education workshop. They learned they had something in common. They were all students in the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences. At that time, 75% of enrolled students and 82% of teaching faculty at the college identified as white. These graduate students sought to uncover the roots of this disparity while supporting students of color. With the help of facilitator Jane Waite, they decided to organize their own workshop about power dynamics in the sciences and invited the CEOS community, CEOAS. They were unsure if many people would attend. To their surprise, over 30 people attended this session and were eager to attend more. In response to the positive reception, this workshop grew to be a year-long seminar series. It is now in its 4th year. Since 2017, we have held numerous events, including keynote talks like this one. Our facilitators have led seminars about topics like intersectionality, ableism, and cultural appropriation.
As the years have gone by, we have extended our reach beyond OSU. In the past 2 years, we have presented a talk at one of the world's largest oceanography conferences. And more recently, we have led a workshop about graduate student advocacy. None of this would be possible without the persistence of the original 3 co-founders and their actions in 2017. We are really grateful for our event's co-sponsors, which include the Office of Institutional Diversity, Graduate School, Postdoctoral Association, PCOSW, College of Engineering, MRM Program, Oregon Sea Grant, and ARCS Oregon. Thank you so much for the support. This event also wouldn't be possible without guidance from these 4 individuals pictured. Thank you all for your advocacy and mentorship. So to give you an overview of today's talk, We'll first listen to a presentation by our speaker, Dr. Aradhna Tripati, and have time at the end to answer audience questions submitted through the Q&A box. Feel free to submit questions during the webinar, and we will do our best to answer them at the end. Additionally, closed captioning is available. To view them, you will need to click the closed captioning button on the bottom of the Zoom screen. We are also streaming this live on YouTube, and that is accessible by clicking the button on the top left corner. The live stream will be available to watch until midnight tonight.
Thanks, Jen. Now to introduce our keynote speaker. They are an associate professor at UCLA with expertise in a geochemical technique called clumped isotope analysis. This method uses the precise measurement of rare molecules in fossils to determine the temperatures of historic oceans or even the temperature of dinosaurs, to name a few examples. She is recognized by many geoscientists for this work and for her long-standing contributions to diversity, equity, and inclusion. For example, she founded the nation's first center to focus on diversity in environmental science. In recognition for her research, education, and outreach achievements, she has received numerous prestigious awards, including the Presidential Early Career Award under President Obama. We are so grateful that our speaker could join us today. On behalf of the Unpacking Diversity organizing team, we would like to welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Aradhna Tripati.
Thanks so much. All right, let's share my screen here. There we go. Apologize for, yeah. Okay, great. First of all, I want to take a minute to thank all of you for being here and to thank Truong and Jennifer Wong-Ala for organizing this virtual visit. I also want to thank Unpacking Diversity and all of the sponsors of this visit and all the folks who have met with me over the last 2 days. So my name is Aradhna Tripati, and as means of introduction, my pronouns are she, they. My family are immigrants from the Fiji Islands with ancestry from India due to both being colonies of the UK. My family and I experienced a number of challenges and barriers. My parents grew up in Fiji at a time where they didn't have the same rights as others. And then on independence continued to experience a number of issues that were legacies of the colonial history, from colorism to racism to sexism. And so they immigrated to this country where they experienced other issues, including incarceration and homelessness, issues that are all too common in communities of color. Now, those experiences have influenced my perspectives on the structural issues in our society and in others. And on reflection, I also realized that my being able to be present in the spaces that I am has taken an enormous network of support. And at various stages, I've benefited from the engagement with compassionate white faculty, role models who are people of color, diverse peer groups and learning communities, and mentorship. And in higher education, I started at a minority serving institution and then moved on to a series of historically white institutions. I'm now at UCLA, where I'm a faculty member, and want to add to the land acknowledgement that T did. Want to acknowledge that I am a guest at Oregon State, which is a land-grant institution, and that the Indigenous peoples of Oregon have stewarded those lands and waterways for generations, and that UCLA is a land-grant institution as well on the unceded lands of the Tongva people, and that land-grant institutions are public institutions that have a complex colonial history and a mandate to opening up space and engaging in reparative work as a result. I want to acknowledge that people from Indigenous groups and other marginalized groups face enormous barriers in higher education institutions, particularly in STEM fields, and especially in the geosciences and related fields, as well as more broadly in society. And I'm going to talk about some of those barriers today, and also some of the work that we're doing to help activate and support networks of students, staff, faculty, in reducing those barriers with a vision of transforming the culture of the institutions that we're part of to contribute to the broader scale movement that is occurring right now to transform society. Now, the program that I'll talk about today in the middle of the talk is one that's led by women, mainly women of color, and the majority of our students are women, mainly women of color. I also want to highlight that the initiative that I'm going to talk about really came from the fact that in my 3 geoscience-related departments at UCLA, I was the first woman of color out of over 50 faculty. All of my departments had poor gender and racial diversity, really low rates of retention generally, and that reflected unhealthy local institutional climates. Those are all symptoms of issues. And a lot of those issues are historic remnants, right, of culture. And so we really began to talk about and organize around how to redefine norms, challenge existing norms, establish healthier norms. And so I began engaging with partners to shape a vision together, really, for what healthier spaces would look like within and outside our labs, more broadly on campus, in the field. So at this stage, we have this long history, continuity of relationship with many of our partners, and I just list a few of them on this slide. We have set up a center, the Center for Diverse Leadership in Science, and it includes geoscientists, social scientists, faculty, student, staff, community partners that have been interacting over the last several years. All right, so let's just look at the broader context that the geosciences and STEM operates in within the higher education landscape. Well, nationally, the data is clear. We're becoming a country of color, but our scientific institutions aren't there yet. And most of our departments at historically white institutions across the country are not prepared. We can see this when we look at national STEM data from education researchers that shows that 20 to 40% of all students who enter college intending to major in STEM complete a STEM degree after 6 years, if they're from groups that have been traditionally excluded, if they're first generation, low income, if they're from particular ethnic groups. What other industry would get by with a 60 to 80% loss rate? Now, with that, what we also then see is telling us not just that people are getting pushed out of science or pulled away, but it actually says something about the unhealth of our culture at this time. I also want to highlight that the institutions that have largely contributed to those students who are persisting, particularly for students of color, are ones that are currently minority serving institutions. So that also shows us that the deficits in our historically white institutions are quite substantial. We have a lot of learning and change to do. Now, I don't know how many of you saw this study by geoscientists Rachel Bernard and Emily Cooperdock in Nature Geoscience, looking at racial diversity statistics amongst PhDs in this country over 40 years. Rachel is an assistant professor and mantle geochemist and geodynamicist. And at the same time, she's also the 23rd African-American woman in the country to get a PhD in geosciences. And that just recently happened. And that's even though since the 1970s, more than 10,000 people who are white have gotten PhDs in this area. So why is there that overrepresentation for some groups and underrepresentation of other groups, given the demographic trends that the US has experienced? I also want to highlight what the numbers look like, in terms of graduates each year in specific subfields at the undergraduate and graduate level for a few areas. When I dived into the NSF data myself, I was shocked to see that, most years there are no American Indian or Alaskan Native women receiving a bachelor's of science in ocean science or in atmospheric science, and that many years we see very few represented or none represented at the PhD level. So the climate that results in these racial disparities also disproportionately pushes out white women, first-generation students, low-income students. Now, from talking to faculty and students here at Oregon State and from looking at the website for CEOS, I saw that, and I understood that many people that are currently present that represent some of the diversity statistics in some sense at present are people who have the experience of being the first or only. And, I know there's a hiring initiative underway. And so also I see that people coming in will also have that experience if care is not taken. Now, what does it mean to have that experience? Well, hopefully many of you have seen this film, Hidden Figures, that's about the experiences that Mary Jackson's photograph shown here, she encountered. She experienced being the first Black woman at NASA in 1958, and her stories and contributions were shared in this film. But, I myself had the experience of being the first at UCLA in California 12 years ago. And, that not unique experience is still happening today for so many. And I want you to sit with the fact that it's been more than half a century since the Civil Rights Act. So what that means is that collectively, our actions and inactions in the geosciences community, and that of previous generations, mean that people have these experiences. And I also want you to know that other fields are doing much better. So our fields really are the dinosaurs right now. And that has a whole cascade of effects. It impacts recruitment, it impacts retention, it impacts whether groups have the ability, like others do, to have the empowerment of their curiosity, their joy, their job access. It's a justice issue, and it also impacts the ability for folks who are not academics in different communities to really feel connected with the science that we're doing. And this is so critically important given issues relating from energy to climate to oceans that really are we issues that take every community feeling connected and feeling empowered to use their voices and take action. Now, of course, we also need to fulfill demand for geoscientists in the academy and in the workforce. And given demographic trends in this country, we're not going to be able to do that if we don't change our ways. But also want to highlight that, women, people of color are a critical source of innovation in science, and that a lack of representation is literally an issue that's making people sick. And so I'm going to spend a few slides on these issues. Now, firstly, I want to highlight that our science, our departments, our colleges, our universities, it suffers due to a lack of diversity, a lack of an emphasis on inclusion and retention. This is one of several studies. My Hofstra et al. Came out of Stanford just last year that looked at this specifically. And what they showed in this case is really compelling because they looked at over 1 million PhDs in this country. So the statistics are there. It's a machine learning-based study that looked at a number of fields, including their sciences. And they found that scientists that are women and scientists that are people of color, compared to other groups, were more likely to identify novel relationships and make scientific discoveries and create innovative research products as part of those PhDs. But then what they also found is that within several years, they were often pushed out, pulled away, and that they often were not cited for their work as well. So they did not really glean the rewards, and they did not get credit. Now, I want you to kind of think about what the impacts are kind of on the individual who encounters a culture that gives rise to that. All right. And I know from looking at climate assessment data from so many institutions, as well as interviews, case studies, that these climates are really prevalent at primarily white institutions. So this is, a narrative from a student that I worked with that just gives you a sense of the story behind the numbers. This is a student who was a first-generation high school graduate, parent that they were helping to support. And, they had always taken pride in being a student who was the first at their university. And at the same time, the isolation that they ended up feeling gave rise to this lack of belonging, and it gave rise to a number of different stressors. And when the issues that were raised by faculty, by our institution, were ones where they'd really personalized these issues, they saw the deficits as being in her, as opposed to being from structural issues. The fact that she was working to help her unemployed single parent with rent and groceries. The fact that she was isolated and dealing with comments and a lack of inclusion, a lack of cultural awareness in terms of how classrooms were structured and the remarks that peers were making, that just became really, really, really challenging. And she said that she felt like the harder she worked, the worse things got. She then began to have panic attacks, depression, anxiety, self-loathing, thinking she didn't belong. And then she began to feel isolated from both her school community and within her own family. Now, those issues, those narratives are all too commonplace. One of my students said to me a few years ago that it feels like an act of resistance right now to graduate with a STEM degree. And in fact, there are a series of stories that are shared from looking at articles like this piece in the New York Times, reading narratives from women of color who are faculty in this 2 volumes, Presumed Incompetent 2, to reading Ruth Enid Zambrana's work on toxic ivory towers and the consequences of work stress on underrepresented minority faculty. All of these things talk about what it means to encounter isolation, to be asked to assimilate to the culture of an institution that was intentionally built historically to exclude you. And when you have a lack of support, or you encounter hostility when you try to raise issues, that unrelenting micro-racism, when there are not resources that you can access, you can find, that has a whole cascade of health impacts. And literally, when it comes to students encountering these challenges, the ones that succeed, that persist, as they go into then the different areas of the workforce, both academic and non-academic, and encounter these spaces again and again, they end up, in fact, becoming ill, and in some cases, dying young. And so this is actually something that Black and Brown and Indigenous faculty talk to each other about. The fact that many of us have colleagues who have passed on far too young, in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. We have colleagues who have collapsed from strokes after turning in their tenure file. And there have been a series of studies that have actually looked at even mortality rates, for example, for Black men who are part of the Yale University and Harvard University graduating classes in the 70s, and then seeing that 10, 20 years later, although they might have only been 3% of the graduating class, they were 10% of the deaths at that stage. So this really, these are real issues that impact our health and well-being. Now, what can we actually then do? Well, I know a number of people here have been participating in reading groups, and they really are interested in learning about what they can do given the historic toxic legacies that we all have inherited, right? And so they're building on that. I want to share with you some additional resources, and I'll share these slides with the organizers to distribute to anybody who's interested, that offer perspectives on higher education and STEM culture, as well as personal and institutional change to kind of go beyond where you're at right now. In particular, I want to call out these 2 volumes and a paper on a series of papers on critical whiteness studies. If you're an administrator, if you're a faculty member, a future faculty member, really read about the historic scaffolds of whiteness in our institutions. I also want to make it clear that, that there's an important role for student voices, faculty and administrators in maintaining systems or in transforming them. Very kind of concretely, one can see from research that many of the blank sheet evaluations, from student admissions to fellowship applications to faculty evaluations, and the policies that we have actually serve to reinforce biases. They can bake in norms that have existed for generations that initially, serve to exclude. And so this really, demonstrates the importance of being intentional, taking really structured, thoughtful approaches, having intentional policies, using rubrics, from how we structure our classroom to how we evaluate for grad admissions, faculty hiring, tenure, and promotions. And there's some wonderful examples of things that one can access along those lines, including through Tessa Hill at UC Davis, Vernon Morris at Arizona State University. Now, I also want to stress it's so important to do this work right now for many reasons. Those justice reasons that I was talking about before, and as I'll talk about later, some of the recent calls to action for change if universities like OSU really want to stay at the forefront. But also, as departments and colleges look to hire in the spirit of inclusive excellence, one really needs to not just think of recruiting people in, but really taking a systemic approach to ensure that people are going to be healthy and thrive as they go through their arc of their career. And there have been multiple attempts at organizing in the past, and there are a number of Black and people of color faculty, white activists who have been doing work across higher education, including in STEM, to open up space for others. But what we see is that there has been pushback, and this type of pushback comes up generation after generation. Recently, we've seen that yet again, from the local scale to national scale, politicians are pushing through policies to forbid acknowledging racism, to forbid teaching critical race theory in K through 12 schools and college. The only purpose of this is to whitewash racism in our institutions, really to change how history and memory serves, so that we don't bring these issues to the forefront of our conversations and start to change policy. So this really is about resistance to calls for change, calls for redistributing power and resources, including in departments, colleges, and society. And there have been outright calls to fire people who raise these issues. For example, right now, there's a very prominent case with Nicole Hannah-Jones, who I show here, who's at UNC Chapel Hill. She was awarded the MacArthur Genius Prize, as one of many awards. And this type of behavior, it's not new. It exists in our field. I myself have experienced it, witnessed it, and spoken out against others when it's happened. And I know of many in the geosciences who point out issues with bias, racism, sexism, call for culture and policy change, but that can make some people uncomfortable. And so there's often resistance to that work. And that can mean, like in Nicole Hannah-Jones' case, negative institutional decisions, having kind of challenging promotion cases, unequal support, and other things. I want you to remember that we used to have apartheid in this country, exclusion based on race, gender, and this is really a key area for organizing around. Now, we're at a low point right now, relatively, in this country when it comes to the climate for diversity and inclusion. The Southern Poverty Law Center has documented that hate crimes have been increasing, inequalities growing, polarization increasing. And that really started disturbingly, taking a different trajectory after the 2016 election. Most of those increases actually occurred at K through 12 schools and at college campuses. Now, folks will be like, well, that isn't happening in California. Actually, California and New York were the top two states that did the most reports. So I want to highlight that, with that, what we see when we look at higher education institutions is critical because, in fact, we encounter people at a powerful time in their socialization. And if we really center equity and inclusion, that's a set of core values in a civil and just society. The lack of it right now means that there will be legacies for the decades ahead that we face in our fields and society as a whole. And that's exactly what history shows, unless we actively work to change it. And that's why over 60 years ago with the Civil Rights Act, it was recognized that we need to ensure all individuals, regardless of background, are treated fairly in education and employment so we can all fully contribute to society. But we haven't achieved anything close to that. But I'm excited for us because we are carrying the helm for change right now and having these broader discussions right now because of good trouble, right? Because of folks like the Unpacking Diversity folks who have asked for us to talk about these issues. So inclusion challenges oppression. And, when we look at when folks encounter higher education, in fact, many folks who then go on into being K through 12 teachers, leaders who shape policy, who are in most rooms of power brokers in society, well, they come through higher education. And universities are some of the most diverse settings that people will encounter over their entire lives, including in Oregon. And so what that means is what we model about how we want to engage with issues of diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice is what folks will take with them and remember as they go into other institutions. Change movements are filled with people who made decisions to interrupt the cycle of socialization in promoting systems of oppression and instead support systems of inclusion and equity. And so I want to highlight that every class that we have a student in, every colleague we mentor, we interact with, these are all opportunities where we shape norms. Now, as a faculty member, I also recognize that 30 years ago when I was an undergraduate, I didn't have the opportunity to take classes in gender studies or critical race theory. And so I didn't have that opportunity to learn about these areas like many of our current students have had. So I appreciate that they bring actually a theoretical and practical understanding and knowledge base with respect to cultural awareness that I don't have, and it's imperative to give oxygen to. And so I've really used that to listen and also to motivate a lot of the reading that I have done. Now, when we look at then as faculty who have been shaped in, with a cultural awareness different from our students, we also have to appreciate that we have chosen to maintain historically white institutions so that they currently are this. And at the same time, the institutions that we're part of, they set not only higher education culture, but broader societal culture. And there can be a disconnect between our intentions and our perceptions of the environment and that of others who come in with other experiences. So, what are some of the things that we might do differently or we might see differently than others might? What is it? What is implicit bias? How do norms differ in terms of what's considered kind of commonplace for some, not for others? Well, there's a whole host of behaviors, very human behaviors that relate to what we do in academia that were compiled by Advanced Geoscience for Women. This is work by Asmarit Burhe, Erica Marin-Spiota, and others. And what this shows is that we really have to actively work to acknowledge the different ways that our socialization has really baked in things in terms of how we see invisible labor. What we think about when we think of speaking invitations or how we engage in mentorship, the ways we might write letters for folks for one group versus another. And also recognize that the accumulation of these issues and the personalization often of what are systemic issues that can impact individuals' career development and also their health and well-being, and so their ability to fully thrive in their educational training and also in their careers. Now, there also are a suite of behaviors just in our day-to-day that can also contribute to inclusive or exclusive climates. And so I've shown on the left the behaviors that are really easy for us to normalize, to tolerate. And this is from my 30 years in higher ed, particularly in my last 12 years, what I've seen in my 3 departments at UCLA and studying everybody's behaviors and then diving into the literature on this. It's really easy for people from marginalized groups to be rendered the outsider, to be invisible, to be excluded, interrupted, stereotyped, bullied. And it's really easy to justify maintaining the status quo or to being silent. And I also see that there are a whole host of biases and actions that people from dominant groups benefit from, but that not everybody has equal access to. Who do resources and networks get shared with? Who do we preferentially give advice to? Are we open to changing for some and to forgiving mistakes for some and being reflective, but not necessarily for others? And the accumulation of disadvantages for some groups and advantages for others mean that some people may face extremely high barriers while others have the wind at their backs that they may or may not be aware of comparatively. And then we can really bake this in with norms and policies that we have and narratives that we begin to share about people. And so I particularly want to highlight that because how do we handle critiques for change, especially perspectives from people with identities differently from ours? So we can be transformative leaders, and one of the most important things to do is to listen, to not just listen to troublemakers, but also realize that they're engaging in good trouble, and that those who we might have seen or heard others talk about as individual complainers are really, truly good trouble. They're actually the peace seekers and navigators that we need, that are shining a light for a way forward given the calls for action, and acknowledging that we hear them and reframing those narratives is critical. And after the statements and reading groups and intent, we also need to, in leadership, be impatient, be strategic, acknowledge that we could have done things differently and do things differently through engaging in action planning and implementation with a shared power approach. The culture of our institutions is constantly being created. So we're either constantly reproducing oppression or we're constantly reproducing inclusion. And we do this individually as agents and then also within groups that are shaping higher education policy on different scales through, as shown in this ecological model. And so with that, resistance can always take place. But as many social scientists have shown, if you're not actively doing this work to open up space for others, you're actually the major part of the problem. And if you are deferring this or shifting responsibility to those with resources or those with power, then in fact, that you perceive as having more, and as opposed to demanding change, then you're also contributing the problem. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., he wrote about this for half a century ago. He talked about the issues with the moderate in some sense, the folks who see themselves as bystanders, essentially. We are the folks who have to actually be the ones to use our voices, call for change, and start planning that out, in fact, and implementing. So from decisions in the higher education space about curricula, codes of conduct, speaking up, who we choose to collaborate with and mentor and admit, those are all ways that we impact each other. Now, Vernon Morris, in a piece in AGU Advances, wrote about 3 critical factors to advance racial equity in the geosciences right now. Investing in robust systems of educational pathways. And Vernon, from Howard University, to become basically a new dean, a director of the Interdisciplinary New School. He's an atmospheric scientist. And 1 year into being in his role there, he is putting resources toward a number of really amazing programs. He's also writing proposals that relate to supporting undergraduates, community college transfers, graduate students, post-bacs, predoctoral folks, faculty development, healthy relationships with community partners, right? That is fearless leadership, which is really critical. Leaders who say this needs to change, and I'm going to put resources towards this, towards building programs in these areas. I'm going to listen and learn and do. And he also sees that if we keep doing things the way we have been doing them, keep doing searches the same way, admissions the same way, then institutionally we'll continue to be the dinosaurs, because there are other places that do have transformative leadership. And by that, I mean equity-minded leadership, reparative leadership, action and metric-oriented leadership, resourceful leadership that's willing to align acts with values. And then he has really emphasized healthy relationships with reciprocity, equity, continuity, from with minority serving institutions to community partners. Now, next, I want to talk about a center I created from experiences in departments and a division that are pretty notorious and have been from before I was here. 30 or so years of this, I heard about it, was warned about it before I came, for being a revolving institution, having revolving doors for women, and for being racially exclusive. So I was hired as part of a cluster hire, and that meant there were a group of junior faculty who all collectively scratched their head about what didn't quite seem right. And we worked together to challenge some of the norms that we were seeing. Faculty shouting at each other, these hostile comments, these deficit models, these unequal sharing of resources and power. And at the same time, I also created a lab and worked to create classrooms and partnerships that were counter spaces. But after several years, what we saw was that although groups of faculty were calling for change, department leadership, divisional leadership, university leadership, they were not empowered to really implement change. A lot of us who were junior and mid-career were troubled. And so really we started thinking about what it would take to change the culture, diving into that literature, thinking about how we could equip more of the bystanders who were gatekeepers to speak up. And so, the center that I'm going to talk about is a Center for Broadening Participation at a historically white institution. It started with one motivated person, first woman of color in my department in a new job with my lived experience and a lot of literature, but then working with my white allies, my colleagues, to create a grassroots effort and to really listen to and involve students and postdocs. We took advantage of the networks and resources we did have, and we kept building. I wrote proposals. They didn't get funded, but we just kept building out partnerships and doing what we could do and planning out the infrastructure. We also thought it was important to sit outside of any one department and instead cut across departments so that we could be effective as possible at creating counter spaces. We didn't want to swim against cultural hegemony of academic departments where norms were deeply baked in, and also where the numbers of marginalized peoples were much more limited, and it can be much more challenging to intentionally change climates from the outset and much easier administratively to personalize the issues. So after 8 years, did manage to get some funding, and at that stage, we had already done a soft launch. We self-declared our center, and we created the first geoscience and environmental center focused on diversity and inclusion at a historically white institution. And so a center with broadening participation at the heart of it, with the science benefiting as a result. Alicia Stokes, one of the co-chairs that first 2 years of our student postdoc leadership team, and then a staff member with us, she developed this logo about how she intentionally uses shapes of people to showcase the human component of contributing to the science community, but also she structured this to show the role we each have in this work. It also stands in contrast to the traditional model for STEM and for higher education, which is much more of a pyramid with a structure that's rigid and separated. Instead, where there are leadership opportunities that are scarce at the training stages. And instead, she emphasizes the importance of interaction between all stages and power sharing, so we can all help one another become stronger with technical expertise in certain areas of science, and then technical expertise in cultural awareness, the social aspects of science for others. She also wants to show with this that the leadership opportunities at each level contributes not only to the individual's strength or success, but also to each other and to the institution as a whole. Now, we have a mission that's really focused on increasing retention. We emphasize retention, and in doing so, we think that will then increase the long-term diversity of innovative problem solvers and leaders with people that have cultural awareness, so that are equity-minded with training specifically inclusive STEM. We use a network leadership approach. We support individual development of students, of faculty as change agents, so that they're pro-social scientists, scientists who can be social community organizers and work with others, but also they're networked together, both laterally at the same educational stage and then vertically and across education and career stages and across institutions. We now have a budget of over $1 million a year, all of which is soft money raised. None of it gets institutional support in that way, although we have support of staff members' time from different centers on campus to partner with us. We recognize that JEDI work, this justice, equity, diversity, inclusion work, is everyone's work. But if it's not part of your job description, if you're a student, if you're a postdoc, then we're going to compensate and recognize the time that you're spending. And in doing so, we're really intentionally being equity-centered and building out the higher education infrastructure to contribute to the broader national movement and global movement we're part of. So, we have a whole series of needs, goals that we have that we assess on. We build also on education research from Silvia Hurtado, a member of the National Academy of Education, showing what inclusive science looks like. Her work comes from a meta-analysis of effective programs in the life sciences. And we have all of these elements in what we do. We have this elite multi-tiered fellowship program from students to faculty, and anybody can join. Anybody can become a member. We meet people where they're at. And at the same time, we provide cohorts with social belonging, mentorship, networking events, skills training, opportunities to put what you're learning in practice, team-based science, team-based outreach, and we also support curricular innovation. Now, logistically, how this happened, I wrote a proposal. My career proposal was one of the first proposals I wrote in my first year as a faculty member. And I really kind of started drawing on the literature and implementing many of these structures to grow myself and to grow my skills as a mentor and educator, and to create healthy spaces for the folks I was working with. And after several years, I was able to assess in 2017, 2018, over 120 people. From my group, we had a 50% response rate. So these data are from about 50 people. And we were also able to show that we had 90% retention rates compared to that national average of 20 to 40% for equivalent groups. We were able to show that technical skills, science understanding, science identity, and higher skills had improved. So then, as we grew out, now we have 24 STEM faculty fellows and over 140 early career fellows that we've supported over the last 4 years from about 24 institutions across the country. And now we actually have our first international fellows as well that we've supported. This is a multi-educational and career stage program. Our reach is much greater than what I've described. Our faculty teach several thousand students. Our community engagement work, talks like this one, we reach thousands of people through that as well. And we directly support our students coming together to create their own programs and our faculty to do the same. So in doing so then, the programs that they have already built or that they would like to connect with others to build have included things like veterans in STEM, environmental justice in First Nations, queers in STEM. And the research that we support them to do include things from physical oceanography, exoplanet research, coastal resilience, and more. And the stipends that we use, the support we distribute, we have a strong equity lens where we look at existing financial aid, other sources of support in order to decide what resources we provide to people. Now, our work does not just involve supporting our fellows, but it also means that we work with other colleagues at different institutions to call for change and to provide strategic advice on changing. And in response to the killings of the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor last year, and so many others, this year, Daunte Wright, Adam Toledo, and many more people, we have seen that there have been even more calls for transformation. Now, these are seen in the higher education space and in the geosciences. Vernon Morris, Lisa White, and several other colleagues and I contributed to this call for action that Vernon led, that really was meant to advise universities, policymakers, as to what they could do in a concrete way to take action. And so, in addition to listening, really making sure that they act, and in doing so, lead. And so I want to highlight that what does it look like to listen and act to dismantle structures that perpetuate injustice and systemic racism in universities in the geosciences. I've been excited to hear at OSU within the college how the systems for personnel evaluations for faculty are undergoing transformation. That has to go hand in hand with a commitment to hiring, supporting, and retaining faculty of color, women, and other faculty who are doing this work and who might otherwise pay a penalty. It means really promoting and rewarding anti-racist policies that are ethical, providing equitable access to mentoring and inclusive administrative practices so that leadership at all levels is actually equipped to change, ensuring that classrooms are equitable so that experiences like the one that from the student's narrative that I showed earlier, so that does not continue to be the norm. And there's so much out there to draw from and credit, including at minority serving institutions, but also from people of color who are leaders at historically white institutions. Now, one of the things that I was very excited to hear about here at OSU is this plan for hiring 10 new faculty in the college. But also I've heard about some of the challenges really in finding people. Well, I want to emphasize the importance of not approaching hiring as single hires. Often when you don't have much in the way of faculty diversity, that's in a state with a history that California has or Oregon has, that's not going to be what draws people there. But when one does cluster hires, like what Georgia Tech is doing, what Stanford is doing, what Scripps Institute of Oceanography is doing, what you find then is that actually when the principles of inclusive excellence are the core principle for guiding that cluster hire, you can actually bring in a lot of the transformative leadership that one wants. Now, there are a number of organizations to contact, not just AGU or GSA. In addition to them, the National Association for Black Geoscientists, SACNAS, ACES, contact these organizations and ask them to distribute these job advertisements to their email lists. Send it to minority serving institution departments in the geosciences and ask them to share with their alums. There may be undergraduate alums like Vernon and myself who are now postdocs in various institutions that are looking for faculty positions. And reach out to folks like us because we have networks that we can distribute it to. Doing that work is so key. Now, Jennifer Glass is a white woman who just got tenure recently at Georgia Tech. I have been so impressed with the work that she did as an assistant professor and now as a faculty member with tenure to really kind of spearhead pushing this forward as well. Folks were saying, I can't find folks to be speakers. I don't know about people aren't applying. She created a handful of resources, a social media handles list for many of these affinity-based organizations, speaker lists in different fields, anybody can contribute to, a geoscientists of color list, over 300 people in one database. And so all of these are resources for thinking about recruitment, not just at the faculty level, but when you're looking for graduate students and postdocs as well. Finally, I want to close with just a few more slides to talk about how, this is not just a handful of us that are now mid-career that are calling for action. In fact, there's a mandate from the geosciences community. Over 30,000 geoscientists signed this change.org petition in the upper right. The call to action I described that Vernon led, No Time for Silence, has been endorsed by our professional societies, by all of them. And in fact, that represents over 60,000 of us. And so with that, it's clear that the departments and colleges that don't act are actually truly going to be the dinosaurs, come 5 years' time, if they haven't actually moved forward with making change. So what does that change look like? Well, my center has been doing an analysis of all the demands letters from faculty and students from last summer in response to this wave of activism. What were we calling for? What did we want to see in terms of transformation for our institutions? Well, it was really interesting that the calls for change from, for example, from the CEOS letter are practically identical to the calls for change at UCLA, at MIT, at Scripps, and a number of institutions. And so what institutions are actually going to do these changes? Those are the ones that are going to contain the innovators of the future, that are going to be succeeding in bringing in grant money from agencies that are emphasizing this, that are going to succeed in raising philanthropic funds from foundations that emphasize this. And they're the ones that are going to have this legacy of being leaders in the field. And so this includes having a true organizational commitment to change, diversifying faculty, making personal commitments to change, moving beyond statements, providing fellowships for POC students, really investing in the health and well-being of Black academics in particular, recognizing and compensating DEI work, presenting demographic data, so that way you can actually use equity metrics to track how you're doing. Now, you're not doing this alone. We have been working with our professional societies. I instigated this series of workshops also as I started hearing from departments, peers, chairs, administrators about some of the challenges that they were facing, but also seeing that across the national landscape, there were so many amazing stories about cluster hires, changes in graduate admissions policies, really kind of transformative work that was being done, systemic action plans being implemented. And so we wanted people to talk about the barriers they faced, but also what was being done to overcome them and highlight these examples of leadership. So we've had these 4 workshops thus far, but the videos and discussions, questions associated with them are available. This is hosted on the AGU website. And this summer, we're going to be instigating some more planning to then have some of these new workshop sessions in the year ahead. I also want to highlight that there are opportunities to submit the action plans you're doing and what the institution, in fact, what the institutional progress has been at conferences. And certainly many program managers from foundations will be present at these, as will many of the next generation and current generation of geoscience leaders to note and see where we should be recommending folks go to. I want to recommend this series of films from filmmaker Kendall Moore, this brilliant academic and journalism professor at University of Rhode Island. She and Catalina Martinez at NOAA facilitate a whole series of transformative workshops associated with showings of these films. And I know that Picture a Scientist was recently shown here about gender-related issues. Her Can We Talk series specifically explores obstacles faced by people of color, including women of color. It also explores in another film what allyship looks like, white allyship, and then a third film that she's making really, centers on decolonizing STEM. And so I strongly encourage continuing with those internal discussions by inviting her, Catalina, to screen the film and engage in workshops here. Now, with that, I just want to put some final slide up with more information where you can learn more about the data for geosciences in this country, learn more about some of the principles from Black feminist educator and scholar Bell Hooks, but also other educators who inspire me, Paulo Freire, Crystal Kobian, and others. Some of the references that inspire the work that I do, how to contact Kendall for film screenings and facilitated discussions, the center I direct, the website there, and if you're interested in slides, I'll provide them to the meeting organizers, but you're also welcome to connect with me if you have any questions. Thank you. So I think with that, we'll exit the show and see if there's anything that folks want to talk about. Thank you.
Thanks, Aradhna. That was great. So I just want to remind folks that if you have a question, to go ahead and submit it in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to your question. Let's see. We did have a question about resources. We'll put some resources in the chat. So our first question is kind of a simple one. What is a deficit model?
Yeah, okay. So a deficit model is one that assumes that or propagates the narrative that when you look at a problem, when you look at something like in a metric that might show differences in performance between one group and another, for example, between women and men in a science class, where does that come from? Or from low-income students and more financially resourced students in, a math or science class, or between different ethnic groups. The assumption that the issue is actually with that individual, or with that group, that the deficit in that group is the issue, as opposed to seeing that the deficit is instead, in fact, in the systems of oppression that intersect to give rise to structural disadvantage, cumulative disadvantage, that give rise to, say, the stereotypes that a person encounters in the classroom that may give rise to those outcomes. It also is one that doesn't look at the strengths and assets that different groups may bring when they come to the classroom or come to that system. So it's kind of a term that was coined in the educational space. What I think is interesting about that is because then, as scientists, we see a problem and we try to come up with okay, how do we address that? Where is that coming from? How do we address it? Well, if we think that the problem comes from a deficit in that individual, if we personalize racism, if we personalize sexism and classism and ableism, then we're expecting that the problem is that individual, right? Or that whole group of individuals. And we're going to design interventions, solutions in that way, instead of actually turning things around. And because that's a misdiagnosis, in fact, of the issues, it doesn't take into account the context, the historical issues at play. It doesn't take into account the biases of the person who's constructing that environment, who holds enormous power and privilege in actually setting that. So I say that, in fact, when we look at educational data like that, STEM educational data like that, on disparities, what it ignores, and what many STEM educators who are the experts in this say, they point out that it actually ignores the deficits in the folks who are constructing that classroom, administrators, faculty members, that we, in fact, are not often at research universities, our training in how to construct inclusive classrooms, our training in how to construct classrooms where active learning or effective learning that takes into account, cognitive science, how people learn, that, we are the ones lacking in that. And so there's a wonderful program that came out of UC Berkeley that it's called Transforming STEM Teaching. It's what is it? It's like the ELP program or something like this. I'll also share this with the organizers. The Faculty Learning Program, FLP is what it's called. And it was developed first at UC Berkeley, but now it's actually expanded across the state. And, I'd gone to like the occasional workshop run by our Inclusive Teaching Center, done some stuff online and learned about, okay, you can do think, pair, shares, you can highlight individuals from different backgrounds when you're in the classroom to construct more inclusive spaces and to construct more active learning opportunities. And so I'd done those things. But it was when I took this class, which was a 6-month-long class, that I really learned about how little I knew in how to support active learning. And so now I encourage faculty to look at these materials. They're all available online for free. You can also pay them to come in and do facilitations for you. We offer this as one of the many offerings for our faculty fellows. If they do this, then they are a faculty fellow and they gain access to resources that we have for working with students and postdocs, and they gain an honoraria for their time. And we also utilize a lot of that curriculum. We encourage future faculty. We ask our early career fellows to meet a commitment to growing their higher skills so they can be more effective scientists and teachers. And so we encourage them to do some of this training themselves as well. So that way we don't continue with deficit models being the norm. Mm-hmm. And I'll say one other thing. When you look at data for a chemistry class, a math class, a geoscience class, what you see when you look at the disparity data, like UCLA has this, that I've been able to see as per person who was on the undergraduate council, it is amazing to see what those disparities are and how a professor who is properly equipped, what a difference that can make. And I personally, after taking that course, I then taught some of the same classes I had before, but in a very different way. And the responses from students, I never had a class that made me think like this, in a class that had so much community in it as well. And so that was incredibly memorable for them.
Okay, on the topic of community, we have a question about cluster hiring. Someone said that there's been a lot of talking about cluster hiring a group of science faculty. It's been a year and nothing has come of that promise. How can we make that pressure? How can we put pressure on to make that happen? What do we do if there's different units at a big institution? What intentional things must one do to make a positive cluster hire?
Yeah, so there's quite a bit of work that shows when you get to a point within an institution, like say within a department at that unit level, where you have about 30% women, that can really start to change the gender dynamics and the issues with sexism in that space, particularly when you have people at both the junior and senior level, right, that are that feel empowered to speak up. The same is true when we think about ethnic diversity. And, I'll also say that when you have one person in a space, there's often intense social anxiety associated with that. The power dynamics also are quite different in terms of how other faculty respond to them. You can get mobbing type behaviors. These are actually like schoolyard dynamics that you can also see for like small children, and so it is really, really important to think about the dynamics of groups, and how sometimes there are just things that we don't even see that we do. But, in the Obama administration, it was pointed out that folks who are at leadership group meetings, that often women were spoken over, or people would say something that they had just said, but they hadn't been listened to. I see that happening at the faculty level, and I've seen that happen at the faculty level. And so when you have multiple people in that kind of space that decide to kind of change things, to speak up because they feel safe doing so, you can start to kind of change those dynamics. And in that case, a group of women decided that they were going to work with their allies and reinforce each other's comments to change those dynamics. So it is really important to have more than one person in a department. If they're in different units at a big institution, which is sometimes what happens with cluster hires, you can do things like see if people are doing interdisciplinary enough work that there can be split appointments. That's often really healthy because then people see different cultures as well and the norms of different groups, and they may bring one set of healthy norms to another and challenge unhealthy norms in other units. I think it is really important also to put pressure on the administration if it's been just a year and nothing's come of that. And, there's a lot that can be done in terms of writing letters collectively as a faculty, making the case for change. If this is something that students want, student voices are extremely powerful. There are also, I think, this business about where are we going to be in 5 years? If we don't start investing in this now, we're not going to be in a position to actually be seen as anything but a dinosaur if we don't engage. There's also things like public pressure, right? That's something. And if you really think that this is problematic, going with a group of faculty to talk with the dean or with the university about how to be strategic about this, it can be really, really invaluable. There's also opportunities to do things like Right to the Advanced program, or there's right now this call for programs around racial equity at NSF, and to think about ways, that potentially resources can be drawn from something like that to support leadership training for administrators, leadership training for folks being brought in, pathways to professoriate type postdoctoral program, like what several institutions are doing. In terms of how, I'm just seeing there are a few questions about cluster hires. So folks were also asking, like, how does cluster hiring help with diversity? So it's interesting. There was a paper that came out that looked at kind of the behavioral psychology of this, and then at cluster hiring, and then also looked at modeling basically the outcomes. And so the first thing is that if we are a group of faculty and there's one faculty line and we are talking about who to hire, it is very easy for us, and we have these narratives of the best. It is very easy for us to go, back to these kind of pretty unhealthy sets of biases that we all have, right? And inevitably, if it's just one, and we're in a space where those resources are really precious, what you're going to see is that the dominant power dynamics are going to come into play. You can do a few things to minimize this, including, what does leadership do, using rubrics, for example. But if you, instead of it being one faculty line, if it's 2 or 3 or 4, and you're looking at that collectively, so you're looking at that pool of applicants together, you actually see that the group dynamics change, because then people feel like, all right, the one person they're lobbying for has a good chance. And at least one of the people coming in is going to be somebody that they care passionately about, but they may not then be as passionate about excluding, folks who they might deem as threatening that one faculty line. The second thing, and then the second thing is that they may also be willing to kind of think about, when it's several lines, really kind of start to engage in longer term strategic planning, right? And thinking about, what does this mean about the community that's going to exist for me, but also for the junior faculty that are going to be the legacy of this department for their decades ahead, so that those junior faculty have more of a voice. The third thing is that cluster hiring is, if you look at with the kind of one-off hiring practices that are typical, the rate at which we tend to enhance gender diversity and racial diversity in faculty is so slow that it may take several decades to reach anything that is approaching parity or reason. But if you actually take this other approach, what modeling studies shows, you can actually really approach those kind of 30% numbers much more quickly, because as soon as you have a group of diverse people in, that starts to normalize, in fact, having different sets of voices.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. So given all your experiences, what made you want to continue in academia? And what advice would you give to people of color, especially women of color in STEM, who want to persist in academia?
Yeah, I think that, it's a choice I grapple with every day, and at every stage of my educational and career development, I applied for other things. And at the same time, I went where there were opportunities. So that was one thing. I didn't always, get jobs to do other things, like to go work at a governmental agency or go work at an environmental consulting company, but I did happen to get this postdoc fellowship or this faculty line. So it's what it is. I think the second thing is that it's, for all the challenges that it has and all that I see, I also appreciate that, access to education and employment, civil rights in those areas have always been at the forefront of organizing for change. It's something that our ancestors, have aspired to and fought for so many. And so we continue to carry kind of that on. And when I also think about it, there was an elder who once said to me, take care of yourself. This is a struggle that has gone on for generations. If you leave, the next generation starts where you started. But if you stay, they start a little bit further along. I think that is really important. And I also think that there are so few people who really actively do this work, that look like me. And so I also appreciate, by shattering that glass ceiling, the folks that come after me, they will, my ceiling will be their floor, as one person who inspired me wrote. And so, I do this for that tidal wave of change to come, knowing that it has impacted my health, knowing that it impacts that of others, but also knowing that other institutions are also like this, right? And this is just really deeply entrenched in society. And so I'm I'm carrying a burden that many do. Just the oppression manifests itself in different ways, in different experiences for people. So my advice is, take really good care. Read I personally am not a person who is religious, but I have a great deal of respect for people who are. There's much to be learned from folks like the Reverend William Barber and the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. when they talk about issues of humanism, morality, that I think really we should all be connected to. And I think that with that, there are lessons from learning about the civil rights struggle and what that looks like. Read what they've written, read what Angela Davis has written, and take heart, because right now there are so many people in predominantly white institutions across society that are talking about this. And so if we can all walk together, if we can push for their better selves and our better selves to be, what guides our walk together, we really do have a chance to engage in this third wave of civil rights activism that, will bear enormous fruit in 30, 40 years. And so we're just at the start of it, but I'm going to do my part for the next few years of it, at least. So.
Yeah, I think you've done your part, and I would absolutely love for you to keep going. You are really an inspiration to us in Unpacking. You're an example of what transformational leadership looks like, and that to that end, it is possible. A lot of times it feels like it's not possible. So we really appreciate hearing your thoughts. Thank you everyone for attending. There is a link in the chat to our website. We will update this keynote announcement page to have all the resources later. So check back at about next week to get links to all the resources. And we hope that everyone continues to learn about these topics. On the same website link, there is a panel registration announcement. For in about an hour, we'll have a Women of Color in Geosciences panel. So it's a geoscience focused panel, but if you have an interest in STEM equity, feel free to join. So thank you, Aradhna. Any last comments?
I think one last comment here. Somebody asked about being difficult, how do you avoid this? And I would say that this is the thing, when you're challenging the norms, you will be labeled as difficult. I set up on Facebook a group for us, the Society for Difficult Women. Marie Curie was difficult, and it's for women and non-binary people and for our allies. So, own being good trouble. Yeah. And really take care of yourself, because being labeled a difficult, that is a form of violence, and often it is done in a way so that other violence, unfortunately, is drawn to you. But remember that those kids who fought to desegregate schools, whose parents took them to schools that they were not supposed to go to, right? Who had things hurled at them, whose families' homes were bombed. They were trouble. They were difficult. The white folks who sat at lunch counters with them and walked with them, they were difficult. They encountered violence. We need to be engaged as best as we are able in these spaces together, and be good trouble together, and call on leadership to walk with us. So
great. Thank you so much, Aradhna. And I think, Jen, do you want to say anything, or is that it?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who attended. It was great to see such a great turnout from OSU